Okay, thanks very much. It's certainly very nice to be here. And generous introduction. And certainly in the past, at certain times in my career, I felt I've been a martyr to my interest in interdisciplinary research. And so I'm glad to find that I think finally it's turning into an advantage due to the initiatives being done here at Hopkins. So I'll talk about today understanding deep networks. This is work done with a lot of my students at UCLA and collaborations with Baidu, CMU. And so here are a bunch of 9 of the people at my lab who are involved in doing it. Various people, École Centrale, Google, CMU, and Baidu. And I guess of 5 of these, I think 3 of them were actually in the lab at one time or another. Okay. I just came in from California, so it's rather early in the morning for me. And as a Californian, I don't usually dress up in a suit and tie. And to make it even worse, I went to the schools in England where from the age of 7 you dressed up like this. So there's nothing that makes me feel more like a 10-year-old schoolboy than wearing a suit. Okay, anyway, so deep networks, as most people know, are extremely successful in many areas like vision, speech. They've really raised the performance level enormously. And so one sign of this is the NIPS Neural Network Conference. 5 years ago, maybe 400 people. Now it's up to 3,700 people attending. You get internet billionaires coming to some of the workshop meetings. Everything gets written up in the New York Times and so on. So there has been enormous progress in them. Have I got the sign on there? Now, what are they? Basically, they're artificial neural networks that have their roots in the perceptrons in the 1950s and the multi-level perceptrons in the 1980s. And possibly, various people would say that the difference between the multi-level perceptrons in the 1980s and the deep networks now are mainly due to the large amounts of data and graphics processing units. GPUs, technology developed by computer graphics, means that you can run algorithms an awful lot, or certain types of algorithms, incredibly faster than you could in the past. And so, if you just take those perceptrons or certain of the work that people like Yann LeCun did in the 1980s, if you'd given Yann the amount of data we've got now in GPUs, he probably could have done a lot of this 30 years ago. They are inspired by biology and have some limited connection to real biological networks. So you saw very nice examples of biology in the last slide. And basically, the deep networks have very little to do with the actual technical side of biology. A very good review of the work is by, in Nature by Yann LeCun, Yoshua Bengio, Jeff Hinton. They're the real people who pioneered the advance of it. So the plan of the talk, the first part is really what are deep networks. If you don't know what deep networks, this is going to be far too short a thing to tell you what they are, but at least it will give you a rough idea. Examples and relations to neuroscience. This part of the talk got compressed as I realized I only had 35 minutes to talk. So I'll say, a slide or two about that. And then the issue that I'm perhaps particularly interested in the moment is what are deep networks doing? Can we get some understanding of what they are by either these adversarial examples, which is trying to fool them, or by interpreting the activity within them? And then fourth, compositions and grammars, which is, you'll see, which I think is what the future of things should be. So deep networks combine perceptrons in a hierarchical convolutional manner. The perceptrons are called filters. The output of perceptron is a neuron, not a real neuron, but an artificial neuron. And I'll probably use the word neuron and filters interchangeably in this talk. At each point in the image, there would be a filter bank, which contains, say, 128, 512 filters. Convolution means that these filters would be applied in parallel with different parts of the image. So you'd have the filters here, you'd have them here, you'd have them here, you'd have them there, etc. Hierarchy means you have one layer of filters and you have another layer, and so on. And the advantage of hierarchy seems to be that you can capture the structure of signals, speech or vision at different levels of abstraction. Okay, so here is the same thing in pictures. A basic neuron has some elements here, inputs, output, and there are weights which are, which report the strength of this output. So in the learning, the last talk, the weights would perhaps correspond, at least crudely, to the synaptic strength of the connections between neurons. A network would be just a bunch of these units stuck together. Important aspect for the learnability is that the output is a differentiable function of the input, i.e. if you change the weight slightly, the output will only change slightly too. That makes it a lot easier to learn for technical reasons. If you want to get a better output, you just change the weights in a small local direction, which makes a learning quite practical. So here is a filter bag. Here is the convolution. You're doing the same operation here, here, here. Here is an input image. This would be the X, Y axes of the image. This would correspond here to red, to green, to blue. Filter bag. The filters would correspond to positions in the image, X and Y here. And then there would be filter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 128 here. And then there would be a hierarchy. This layer would feed into this layer, would feed into this layer, feed into that layer. Here is a particular deep network, AlexNet, named after Alex Kravitsky. And this paper, Kravitsky, Sutskeva, and Jeff Hinton, was the one that, at least in my field, made people think that deep networks had to be taken seriously because of their performance, how well they performed on a particular difficult computer vision challenge. So the network has 650,000 neurons, 60,000 parameters or weights, and the learning is adjusting the weights of these parameters to make sure that the output, in this case detecting an object, which object there is in this particular part of the image, can be estimated from the activity of the filter patterns. So these numbers are big, but again, they're nowhere near the numbers of neurons that you heard about in the previous talk. So here was the challenge was to take images of this type. Can't see where this thing is going. Yeah, images of this type. This image, this image, this image, but you take millions of them, and you'd want to classify this as a car, this is a mushroom, a dog, a cat, or something of that form. And they performed incredibly well on this compared to what we could do before. Reasons, I would say, the ability to share features between different objects. So you could extract, if you only wanted to recognize a few objects, that would not be so hard. Here, you want to represent thousands of them. You want to find the features which are in common between different objects. The learning rule is very simple. That doesn't mean it's easy to do. It would take you a week or several weeks to train a system like that from scratch. And the computations can be efficiently done by GPUs. Okay. So the deep network examples, the idea of detecting an object like that is a coarse example in the sense the top level of the network is just saying car or cat or whatever it happens to be. It's not giving you a description. It's not saying that this is a blue Prius seen from behind or anything like that. It's throwing away that sort of information. It's trying to get something at the top level that is invariant to the details of what's going on in the input. So that's one category of tasks they're good at, but people have also managed to get them to do high precision tasks as well. So almost any task, well, many tasks in computer vision, classic tasks like detecting edges in images. So here would be examples of images. This would be the output of an edge detector trained by deep network by Zoran Chu's group at UCSD. I guess if you don't know vision, you may not be impressed by this. If you do know vision, and if you've worked in vision as I have for 30 years, this is an incredibly good estimate of the edges. Okay. Also over here, this is work from my group about semantic segmentation. So you're not just trying to find the bird in the image, but you're actually trying to label the pixels in the image that correspond to the bird, the pixels that correspond to the sky, and so on. Again, this is not at the level of human performance, but it's sort of incredibly, enormous amount better than what was done 5 years ago using previous methods. Also, another sort of advantage is that these methods are, before we were doing things not as well as that by sort of stitching together various types of methods in a somewhat ad hoc, messy manner. And here, the idea is you just throw it into a deep network and it does all the work for you, which is simpler and nicer in certain respects. Okay, here's another work that we did. This work got written up in the New York Times. Unfortunately, not our part of it, but a friend of mine, Heinrich from Germany, emailed me and said, look, Alan, you said this sort of thing was impossible, and now I'm reading about it in the New York Times. And so I said, well, the New York Times has unfortunately exaggerated what we could do. The idea here, is that you take an image and you want to get a verbal description of it. You want to get the algorithm to produce that automatically by training without anything else. And so here, for these images, you're getting a description, a bowl of food on a table, a train traveling down tracks. These things look good. And these ones, if you knew Chinese, these also pretty impressive examples of going from images to captions. So it sounds like you've almost solved the vision problem. You've given an image and you produced a description of it. And that's what my friend Heinrich was thinking after reading the New York Times article. And nevertheless, I think the answer is that we and many others, a whole lot of people who developed these methods at almost exactly the same time last year, have made a big jump in the performance on these tasks, but these methods are very easy to fool and then nowhere near the level of a human performance on them. Okay, so deep networks like real neurons, well, there was some, here are a few slides I just got off Google, but real neurons look rather different from the simple neurons I showed earlier. My understanding is real neurons are complicated. There are many different types of neurons and many different types of neural circuits. It's a lot more complex than the simple pictures I put up earlier. Okay, sorry. So the visual system, there's some biological inspiration for it. The visual system does have, is hierarchical. The ventral system, which would be involved in recognizing objects, would start from low-level areas, V1, V2, and go up to IT, the inferior temporal lobe. And there's been some experiments by, I think, Jim DiCarlo's group at MIT, which would say that you can look at neurons in IT and you can perhaps predict their performance by using a deep network. So you would train a deep network, and from a deep network, you could look at individual neurons in the network and see what stimuli they like responding to. And then you could do electrophysiology, put an electrode into part of IT, and for a particular neuron, a real neuron, you would test its response, and then you could try and match it to one of the neurons in the deep network. So there's been reports from DiCarlo's group that you can do some reasonable fit using these methods to neurons in IT. In more recent work that's done by my colleague Tai-Sing Lee at CMU, we're actually using similar methods to fit neurons in the areas of V1, V2 to neurons in deep networks. But that's sort of at the level of a sort of a rather abstract mathematical model that predict a neuron. It's not saying that the deep networks are actually behaving like the real neurons, because they're obviously far too simplistic to do that. Nevertheless, as a modeling tool, these methods seem to be quite good. Anyway, that's my short part about neuroscience, highly compressed. And then, hang on, what's happening here? Oh, do I have to point this in a particular direction? Okay. But then getting into the issue of really what are deep networks doing. So deep networks are like, one level they're like black boxes, huge numbers of hidden neurons and filters, and even large numbers of parameters. And black boxes are unsatisfying, even if they work, you'd like to know why they're working. If the ultimate solution to computer vision was just that you take an enormous data set and you throw a deep network at it, people like me would feel very disappointed. you know. And also, I think more seriously, if a black box doesn't work, you don't know why it doesn't work, you do not know how to improve it, how to make it better. You'd like to have a system that you could diagnose, you could understand the components, you could move them around, etc. I think if you also try and treat them as models of human perception, it's clear that humans, at the behavioral level, humans don't behave very much like this. Humans can learn novel concepts from very few examples. The deep networks need enormous amounts of data to train them on and so on. So there are some differences. Nevertheless, given the success of deep networks, it would be good to try and understand them as much as we can. So two types of approaches here, one being adversarial examples, try to find neurons that fool the deep network and use that to get some understanding of what the deep network is doing. And another one is more to try and go into the interior of the deep networks and see what's happening there. I was starting to use the idea of sort of look at the entrails, but I found with the Chinese students in my group, no one knew anything about reading entrails. The connection to classical literature was completely irrelevant to them, so I took that out. But I think the idea of looking inside the guts and reading the entrails was a term that was is basically what we're trying to do there. Okay, so here is an example that rigged up by my student, almost a game: how to turn a penguin into a person, give it a television. So what's happening here is that you have the picture of the penguin. This sort of box around it means that it has been detected by the deep network, and the deep network has classified it as bird because the deep network doesn't know anything about penguins. It doesn't know penguin, but it classifies as bird. Now you take the same picture, but all you do is you move the television in here, and suddenly the penguin is now a human. The network knows that this is a television. It's classified that as a television, but the network isn't smart enough to know that the television, doesn't mean that the thing is a human. So there's been a lot of other interesting work. Here are a couple of references on it, where you can show how to fool a deep network. So what's happening here is sort of a little bit of context. The thing is, in the data sets where you're training on, if there are computers, there are often humans nearby. So it's a queue for humans. And there are, and if there was a computer, there's often not a bird next to it. So the network is taking advantage of that, which works on the data set, but is something that's not going to work every time in real life. The text captioning work that I mentioned earlier, the sort of mistakes it makes are very similar. In the text captioning data set, giraffes are always close to trees. And so, you can label, the deep network for text captioning will produce a label of giraffe, next to tree. But if the giraffe was just by itself down here, it would never find the giraffe. It would not know it. So it sort of overtrains certain aspects of the data set. Here are the cases: context, and occlusion. So here, a sofa, and I think everyone would see this as a sofa and not have any, you'd recognize that as a sofa within 150 milliseconds. But the deep network does not do it here because you put various occluding objects over it, and the deep network isn't able to reason about those occlusions. I mean, deep networks can deal with certain types of occlusions, but not these ones. Here again is context. There was a boat here in the classroom. The deep network does not find that because it's never been trained to have deep networks in classrooms. They don't happen there. Similarly here, this plane is detected correctly as a plane, but the plane down here is now seen as a boat because it's just next to the water. So the deep network here, they're dealing with context. They're sort of exploiting context. Sometimes that's good for it, but often it's bad. And occlusion causes problems. Okay, so can we understand it? Now, moving into a second stage, can we understand the neurons? So you can take a pre-trained network. I think I went one more slide here. Okay, so people have done work on visualization, and I think that Zeiler and Rob Fergus, their work was perhaps the first one of it, which is you took a neuron in a deep network and you tried to see what type of stimuli activated it. Okay, so if the deep network is detecting a car, then does its neurons, does it have neurons referring to different parts of the car? And so this suggests a strategy which you start looking at the neurons in the deep network and try to see what they like. So people have done this. Our attempt here was to do it in a rather more quantitative way, and also bring in an issue about population encoding. Forget that. So here, for example, if we take a deep network and then you apply it to car images and you look for a neuron at one level of the network, say level 5, you'll see that this neuron actually does indeed like tires. This is showing you the sort of the top 9 things it really likes, which happen to be all tires. And then these are random samples from the top 100 or the top 500 things that it likes. So you can see this neuron is actually finding parts reasonably well. But this is only one neuron, and another neuron would respond to things like this, which don't seem to have terribly much in common between them. And so ballpark figure is, say, maybe roughly 20% of the neurons respond to parts regularly, but the remaining 80%, you don't know what they're doing. So now I'll move on to the idea of neurons or neural populations. So I'm saying the neurons are not ideal as part detectors, only 20%. 20% is probably a generous upper bound for them. But then you also think there's a bit of a complexity problem, because this network was trained to recognize 400 different types of objects. If each object has 30 parts, as a conservative estimate, then that means that you would have 12,000 parts you'd want to represent. In this network, you've only got 512 neurons. They just cannot represent that number of parts. It's impossible. So instead, you start thinking of representing object parts by populations of neurons. This gives you, enables you to deal with the variability a lot, the complexity a lot more easily. And there's neuroscience analogy. So Horace Barlow put down the idea of a grandmother cell, that there was a neuron in your brain that responded every time your grandmother was there. And then George Zopoulos, did experiments about neural population encoding that you could record from a bunch of neurons and use that to predict the velocity estimation and so on. So there were two sort of different strands of thought and between individual coding by neurons or coding by populations. So here we thought of exploring the population encoding idea by doing clustering. So you take the deep network, you train it on ImageNet, you now apply it to particular car images. It could be cars or airplanes. The important thing is that they're all images of one particular object class so that you can get some understanding of it. At the deep networks, you measure the filter responses and your activity, and then you cluster them by grouping. This means that you can start finding certain sets of neurons that seem to fire together reliably. Neuron A fires magnitude 10, neuron B fires magnitude 5, neuron C fires magnitude 7, but that combination happens really frequently. Okay, so we do this with very low-tech machine learning methods, sort of k-means, clustering techniques to get concepts, and then you call these clusters visual concepts. And then if you apply this to these rigid objects, either cars or airplanes or things of that sort, then you find roughly 70, maybe 80% of these visual concepts, these clusters, actually do correspond to parts that look meaningful. And so that's up from 15, 20% for the individual neurons. Okay. And so we could identify, this is qualitatively, identify visual concepts that correspond to parts of the object. So here would be a car, a box would be the part, and the number is indexing the visual concept that we have learnt, before. So they correspond to things like wheels, then the sort of, side of the car seen from here, side of the car with a little bit of ground underneath, windows, and so on. Okay. Now, it's not that the visual concepts correspond to these sort of 100% accurately. in fact, if you look carefully, there's quite a lot of similarity between this pattern here and this pattern down there. There was a line coming down, there's a line coming down, there's sort of some metal here, there's some metal here. There is a window here, but the window is not, the window, at least the interior parts look a bit like the background. So there's a lot of similarity between here and here, and you'll find a visual concept that seems to correspond to this and to that at the same time. Here would be examples of them. I could show you tires, but the tires are sort of as good, as nice as the tires I showed you from the individual cells before. And so here are tires with a bit of context, a tire with a bit of metal behind it on the right, a tire with a bit of metal on the left. This is sort of like the front of the car, mud guards, and so on, license plates, side of the car, and ground below it. This is the sort of the window area here, this sort of pattern that corresponds to the side of the car, etc. So the responses are fairly, the response of these visual clusters are fairly reliable. So by doing this population encoding, you're getting, I think, a better understanding of what's going on inside the network after it is trained. Okay. So combination of neurons would correspond to parts, or perhaps more accurately, to what I call deformable templates. Parts suggest that it's sort of more symbolic, that it knows that it's a tire. It doesn't really know it's a tire. It knows it's a pattern. And it knows it wants, it wants patterns that are very similar to each other, which for tires correspond to variants of tires. And for other things like, like the side of the metal, it thinks this is visually similar to that, which it is. So templates are basically very fixed, rigid things, and these deformable templates mean they're flexible. So it allows a certain amount of geometric changes there and a certain amount of changes in the appearance. And that, I think, is evidence here that that's what the deep networks can be doing. Now, those are very nice because if you have deformable templates of that sort, there are many good things you can do with them. People like me, 20 years or 20 years ago have been trying to find models of deformable templates of patterns that can happen in images and haven't been terribly successful. Here with the deep networks, it seems that you're able to get these deformable patterns, deformable templates out very, effectively as a sort of an output of the network. So combining together these two pieces of evidence, the adversarial studies show the deep networks are sensitive to context and occlusion. The neural population studies show that they're representing deformable templates which can deal with a certain amount of variability, but not too much. Okay, so I think for me this brings up, I think, limitations of current deep networks and the need for additional architectures. So talking about limited variability, if I stand like this, there's very little variability in my appearance. If I start moving my arms around, there's an incredible amount of variability, and there's also a bigger variability in the spatial distances between my parts. Okay, if I stand here, my arms are just next to my side, and variability is limited. So I think the deep networks will have problems with these sort of variations, dealing with humans like these, dealing with severe amounts of occlusion, and also with context. So that leads to a class of work that we were doing before, which sort of is almost combining deep networks with higher level reasoning. So in this case, the task is to detect humans as represented by joints, positions, and so this is the output that you'd like to have. You have a point here at the top of the head, you have a point here for the elbow, and so on, and you want to get this representation out from there. So for the humans, this is a sports data set, so the humans have incredible amounts of variability in shape and appearance. If you just throw a deep network at this, it does not do very well. Now, it's hard to quantify that because people don't publish many deep networks on that because they don't indeed work terribly well. But the reasons I'm giving is I cannot see the deep network would have the ability to deal with those types of variations. On the other hand, if you do what my student Xin-Jie Chen was doing, is it used the deep networks to detect parts of the object like the elbows. So For the elbows or for the joints, there's a lot of variability there, but still it's a variability that you can handle by having large numbers of deformable templates for them. Okay, it's local. So it seems that you can locally make reasonable estimates of where the joints are and the local configurations for them using a deep network. So, okay, and then you can just use a different method, pictorial structural graphical model, compositional model, just to stitch these parts together to get a human. Okay. You can do this even, you can extend the approach here to a case where you're looking for a human where large parts of it are occluded. So this is a full human model. This is a model where bits of it, increasing bits of it are missing. And so with a deep network, it's not really able to represent all these possibilities efficiently. But if you do it by having parts and allowing flexible compositions of them, then you can both represent what's happening here very effectively. You can also do inference over it very effectively. You find the parts, you can glue them together to form this, or this, or this, or this, or this, and you get very good performance results by doing that. There are other examples here where you use the deep networks to get your sort of low-level type representations in terms of torsos or heads or parts of an object, and then you use more complex grammatical models which will combine these parts together to decide whether it's a dog or a cat or a sheep or a horse, and to label the pixels of them. Okay. Down here for humans, humans wear clothes, humans have different poses. There's a whole complexity of appearances that humans can have. And the strategy we have, which seems to be working well, is to use deep networks to find the low-level parts accurately, and then use these more high-level grammatical rules to combine them together to form structures, to give the complete interpretation. Okay, so conclusion, I think I'm just on time, is that I think while deep networks are very successful for many applications, and anyone in my field who doesn't use them is perhaps shooting themselves in the foot somewhat. But there are certain limitations to what they can or cannot do. I think that they don't perform at human level. You can fool them by context, by occlusion, by variations of spatial pose and things of that sort. And I think if you take the types of studies I was doing on the neurons or the population of neurons, it looks like they may be representing sort of templates, deformable templates of parts. And that is very useful, but it's not, I think, flexible enough to deal with occlusion, to deal with these other types of variability issues. So I think, from my experience, I think the deep networks can be used best as components within the richer architectures, which are the compositions and grammars. But the deformable template aspect of them is really important. There's a whole enormous variety of visual patterns, and if the deep networks can do with that low-level part, then the rest of it can be done quite, can be done by other methods. For people who work in computer vision, there was a story that in 1960, I think Marvin Minsky told a student to solve vision over the summer as a summer project, and it didn't work out. Now, I should ask him whether that's really a correct description of it, but I think basically, though, he didn't really want the complete description of vision. What he wanted was something that could find certain objects for him, fairly simple objects, because that was the part he wanted the student to do, because then he thought once you found these objects or parts of them, then the interesting part of vision would occur. And so for me, it seems like the deep networks give you a way of doing what Minsky wanted the student to do 60 years ago. You can find the parts, you can find the object instances, but then maybe the more interesting part of vision will be putting those things together, to deal with composite objects and to deal with composite scenes. Anyway, that's the end of the talk. I have some citations to my group and then even more citations to the deep network community. So I'll stop there.
Do you think that the individual filters in your networks might be more interpretable in terms of geometric parts rather than semantic parts like tires, since a given view of a tire can be geometrically different from another view of a tire?
Yeah, well, I think there are combinations of things that have very specific appearance patterns like tires, but a lot of the others, I mean, you're right, they are very much like geometric structures. I'm not sure I can draw it, but you know, the issue of the front of the car, you have this pattern, then you have a line coming up here and a line coming down there. We did some studies on this where you take one of those visual concepts, you run an edge detector, and then you take the average of the edge, and you find these nice patterns coming out. So I think they should be capturing certain forms of basic geometry processes, as you're saying, which could indeed relate to some of your own research, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, could you maybe comment on the relationship between deep learning and reinforcement learning? Since deep learning, if I understand it correct, is supervised learning, isn't that right?
Yeah.
So it requires some external source of a target, whereas reinforcement learning does not necessarily need that.
Yeah, no, reinforcement learning, yeah, you know, I think the classic reinforcement learning was getting a machine to play backgammon, where it only got a reward when it actually won the game of backgammon. Mind you, it took the machine a long time to learn by playing against itself, but it had that reward. Yeah, I think the aspect of deep networks being fully supervised is very, you know, it's sort of unrealistic from a human perspective, I think. You know, no child learns, you know, I guess no one learns by having a whole random set of images shown at you. So I think there's perhaps ways of improving that, you know, I mean, ways actually even on the computer vision, machine learning side of improving the learning by giving structured sets of images and so on. I think a certain amount of feedback is necessary at some level. I mean, having said that, there has been some work, I think from CMU, where they were showing that you could learn sort of at least deep networks which were not as good as these ones, but not bad, just by having motion sequences and tracking between them. So training the network just based on its ability to track various objects without knowing what the objects are. So it could be possible that you could learn a lot of the filters without having full supervision. I mean, that's exciting. That's, you know, that's recent.
I'm wondering about the adversarial examples, and then also the rest of the work you presented after that.
Yeah.
So in the adversarial examples, I don't know if those were just toy examples that you were showing, if those were genuine images, but the images are chimeric, right? So they're taking it's not one image, it's taking multiple images and trying to compose them into a single image, and presenting it to a network that was not ever given the option of believing in such images, of representing chimeric images that were half of a chicken and half a goat or whatever.
Yeah.
And if that's right, I was trying to understand them as maybe failures of the deformable templates at the edges. Basically, they're looking to have a smooth blend of deformable templates as it moves across the image, but those chimeric points give it a place where it can't resolve the blend from one part of what is actually two images, image A to image B.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I thought about related to this was what potentially might change with 3 dimensions as opposed to 2 dimensions in what you presented at the end. So the part segmentation that's going on in 2 dimensions, the kind of ambiguities and difficulties that arise in 2 dimensions, either under situations of 3 dimensions or movement, right? Like with the human body case, actually presenting movement might change the character of the part segmentation to something that was more skeletal rather than pixel-based.
Okay.
And those were the thoughts.
3 points. Okay, so the first point is, yes, in a way we're being unfair to the deep network by giving it images that it was not trained on. On the other hand, the set of images is infinite. The set of data sets so big is finite. So, boats, an airplane, right? Airplane's in the sky, but you could put the airplane in here and everyone would see it, I would guess. So I think it's reasonably fair to put those things in there. Some of them were a bit extreme, I would agree, but I think the same results hold if you're a bit more careful and you allow objects to move around in them. The deep networks would not be trained on those. On the other hand, not even if you take an infinite number of images or examples with all different types of occlusion patterns and all different types of context, I don't think even Google has enough computational power to store all those things. So I would see the issue is trying to learn on the smaller cases and then managing to generalize out from them. In terms of what happens to the parts, I'd say that the deep network is, outputting sort of the car at the top level. It does not know that cars could be occluded heavily, and I would say that an advantage of the part type representation, if that's right, is that you could go inside the network and say, hey, my tire detector is firing, even though my higher level car detector is not, because the deep network has only seen part of the tire, it's seen enough to do that, but the rest of it's occluded, or could be explained by some other system. So like with the penguin, part of the penguin was occluded by the television set. The deep network isn't smart enough to know that you would explain that part of the image, and hence you shouldn't try and explain it with the deep network model for that part. Damn, I'm forgetting what your third point was.
3-dimension versus...
Oh, 3 dimensions, yeah. I certainly believe from the computer vision perspective that you ought to be moving to 3D as soon as possible. And so the models here are all 2D. I think that's a limitation. If you have sequences, yes, you can certainly do better also. On the other hand, in many of these cases, humans, at least after they've learned, humans will really do well on these static images. And for the learning, the sequences are probably very important. And I think the 3D, I'd say, though important for single image, is probably even more important for once you've got sequences as well. So I really would say, yes, I think sequences and 3D are important. The patches here are more like, they're 2D type things, but they ought to be stitched onto some 3-dimensional model, I would say. But give us a few more months.
We're going to take one more question, so a quick one.
Very quick. I can imagine that the Defense Department would be very interested in this work. For example, to determine if the Iranians are cheating on the nuclear agreement, or for drone targets. Could you comment on this?
Gosh, maybe I should try and get funding from them. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of application for this. There's a lot of applications for this type of work. And possibly there are concerns at some level about civil liberties, and some issues have come up in that. Okay, there are speed cameras where I'm driving in California, and you feel it's a bit unfair to be caught like that. I think I don't directly do contract work for the government. We do have funding from various sources, including some of the Army sources, but the funding is also coming from NSF, NIH, and it's sort of very fundamental type of work, I think. Yeah, so there's a lot of practicality on this. If you go down to Silicon Valley, you'll find practically everyone is using deep networks for certain types of things. Google, Amazon, Baidu, all those companies are doing it. And so I assume the Defense Department is doing it as well, I would guess.
All right, let's thank Alan again.
Thank you.